Well, so good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining this final roundtable that we've titled New Accountabilities and Teachers' Professionalism. We have the pleasure of being joined by Bob Lingard, Gemma Moss, Melanie Ehren, and Javier Campos. Bob Lingard is a professorial fellow at the Australian Catholic University and an emeritus professor at the University of Queensland. He researches and publishes in the field of sociology of education, and his most recent books include Reimagining Globalization and Education, Global National Networks in Education Policy, Primary Education, Social Enterprises, and the Teach for Bangladesh, Globalization and Education, Digital Disruption in Teaching and Testing, and Globalizing Educational Accountabilities. Gemma Moss is Professor of Literacy at the University College London Institute of Education and the Director of the Economic and Social Research Council's Education Research Program. She's interested in the shifting relationships between policymakers, practitioners, and stakeholders that are reshaping the literacy curriculum and the use of research evidence to support policy and practice. Melanie Ehren is Professor in Educational Governance and Director of the Research Institute LEARN at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and Honorary Professor at the University College London Institute of Education. Her research combines a strong disciplinary background in educational and school effectiveness with a comparative approach to understanding outcomes of education systems. Her international work on school accountability, evaluation, and improvement has included the US and various countries in the EU, Africa, Asia, including visiting scholarships at the University of Harvard, Columbia University, and reviews of accountability systems for the OECD, UNICEF, and the EU. Javier Campos is PhD in Social Justice Education by the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's the co-founder of the campaign against standardized testing, Alto al CIMSE, in Chile, where he has worked on designing and implementing experimental programs that foster inclusion and school success through assessment for learning at the local level. He is currently an assistant professor at the Institute of Education Sciences of the Universidad Austral de Chile, researching educational inclusion in teacher training and higher education. He participates in the working group on educational policies and the right to education of the Latin American Council of Social Sciences, CLACSO, and is one of the national coordinators of the Teacher Work Studies Network Estrado in Chile. Thank you all for being here. So the purpose of this roundtable is to think and hopefully reimagine the current hegemonic model of test-based accountability and to discuss alternative models of accountability that could promote teacher professionalism and education quality and equity. And we will have two rounds of questions, rounds of comments along two sets of questions, one addressing the future of accountability policies and another one more focused on understanding to a certain extent the political economy of advocating accountability reforms, drawing on the experience of our four presenters. So without further ado, let's begin with our first set of guiding questions. These are: what are the most relevant contemporary trends in accountability policy in education? Are so-called intelligent accountabilities possible? How and to what extent can accountability systems generate useful data for schools? And finally, are there experiences of accountability policies that can build on instead of undermining professional autonomy? We will first address these questions in this order and then come back for the second round of questions starting from Javier. Thank you.
Thank you. So what are the most relevant contemporary trends in accountability policy in education? I suppose the attempts to reconceptualize and challenge the current dominant mode, and these have been called rich and intelligent accountabilities. Are so-called intelligent accountabilities possible? Well, I would say they're necessary and needed, and we have to have an aspiration towards them. So I'm coming from the position that accountability is absolutely necessary, but needs to be reconceptualized. And in the typology put up by the Reform Project, Anglo-American manifestation of SAWA, very much top-down, test-based, one-way gaze on teachers' work, census testing, to hold schools and teachers to account. The evidence in Australia is overwhelming that in schools in poor communities with low-performing students, the curriculum has been hugely narrowed. Not so in the high-performing middle-class schools. It's had limited impact there in that way. And the second negative in the Australian context is we've seen in schools in poor communities that the higher-performing students have moved out. And what we've had in Australia since 2010 and the impact of this model of accountability is schools with more homogeneous disadvantaged students in them, which has negative structural effects. So, the need to reconceptualise, and here I'm going to draw on a research project I was involved in and a paper which has been published in the Journal of Educational Change with two colleagues, Sam Seller and Asper Baroutsis. So we need to reconceptualise. And I just want to make a couple of opening comments. The first thing I think is the dominant mode of accountability is accountability holding someone to account. I think the other meaning, giving an account, needs to be brought in to complement being held to account. Comparison is central to the current mode of performance-based accountability, and Isabelle Stengers, the philosopher of science, Belgian philosopher of science, says comparison must not be unilateral and especially must not be conducted in the language of just one of the partners. Otherwise, it's unethical. And I think the dominant mode is a one-way gaze, and the field of judgment is controlled by people, and those that the gaze is on have no say. There's no reciprocity here. So I'm drawing on this research we conducted in Queensland. It's unusual sort of research for me. I've done all the critical work about the policy developments, and this came out of a conversation with the Director General of Education in the state of Queensland, who wanted another model. It was a time that there was a Labor government in Queensland, a Conservative federal government, and she wanted a model to compete against the dominant NAPLAN-based model. And so she said if we would do research with a group of schools in a rural part of Queensland and work with the community over a period, 5 years it was, to develop an alternative model, that's what she wanted, and she'd fund a postdoc and another researcher. And so we went on to do that. Now, there are a number of stages that I can't talk about in the project. The first, in this rural part of Queensland, we did deep case studies of 8 schools. The second, we developed with the teachers, and we had money for them to have time for preparation, and with students to develop history and social studies units which were grounded out in their communities, where the students researched the community was brought into the school. And over this time we were meeting with principals and teachers in an ongoing way to build a trust. What we then did, drawing on the work of Sarah Watmore at Oxford and the notion of competency groups, and you can have a look at YouTube in a flood mitigation process that she was involved in. And it's a bit like the Lewis Moll funds of knowledge notion about communities, where the argument is that there's expertise, but expertise of different kinds. And the competency groups around solving a problem, the flood mitigation, there were hydrologists, scientists, but people, local experts who'd lived in the community. And the recognition of different modes of expertise brought a solution which was different if it had only come from the local experts or the scientists. We used that model, and our question really was to try to develop an alternative, rich mode of accountability. And to attempt to do that, we created something called a learning commission. We had a retired school principal from one of our schools chaired it, and we had all of the community representatives, a local politician from sporting groups, Indigenous groups, business person, media, and we had the research director of the State Department of Education on that commission. And we put a question to them, and this was the question when we call for public submissions and people to come to appear before the Learning Commission over a 2-year period. We asked the Commission to try to answer this question: what do the communities here want from schools, and how would we know if they'd achieved what the communities wanted from schools. And so out of this, we came up with an alternative model of accountability which had a different form, not just vertical, unilateral, but was also upwards, drawing on that Linda Darling-Hammond opportunity to learn standards, and an argument that not just the test data, but other narratives, other sort of data was necessary to represent all of the things the schools were achieving. As well, there was an argument from the community that there should be the schools in the community in the schools. We needed these horizontal modes of accountability. So there was a different form, the content, not just test-based, qualitative data, narratives, and so on. And the effect was about a deliberative democracy to include all of the voices in the community, in the school, the teachers, the principals, in constructing this mode of accountability. And the last point I'd make, and I might come back to it in the next round of questions, the Director General who sponsored this, we were to have this final conference where the senior executives would hear all of the community tell the senior executive of what was required and how they wanted to reconstitute this rich mode of accountability. But that person moved jobs, a new Director General came in. We presented to the Director General, and he kept saying, I know the community loves it, the principals love it, the teachers do, the parents do, but Bob, can you give me a metric for these non-numbers approaches to accountability? Yeah, I'll come back to that.
Okay, I think the most relevant contemporary trends in accountability policies is that basically they don't do what they say on the tin. So they claim that they will improve schools, and they claim that they will improve the quality of the schools, and they claim that they will make a better performing system that suits everybody. This has self-evidently been proved not to be the case. On the other hand, following on from Patrick Legal's presentation in the first keynote, I think one of the notable things about accountability processes once they're in place is that they just exist as instruments, so their failure to deliver doesn't dislodge them. Nobody takes account of that and then dislodges them. So you could say they're kind of zombie policies walking on. Are there alternatives? Yes, I think there are. I think there are two ways of thinking about intelligent accountability. We can think about intelligent accountability as geared towards building system knowledge that is context sensitive, as well as reliable and robust. By system knowledge, I mean shared by the stakeholders in the system. It's got to be reliable. I think researchers have a role there in being able to moderate on in how system knowledge gets created. I also think, very importantly, accountability has to be democratic. Intelligent is not enough, it's got to be democratic, which riffs off what Bob was saying. That means there's got to be meaningful engagement and deliberative dialogue between all stakeholder communities, parents, pupils, teachers, policymakers. I am intrigued that in England at the moment there is a move towards deliberative dialogue. It is the latest buzzword. It is going on across a whole load of areas of social science. I'm going to try and run it into the education research program that I'm working on at the moment. All of the main players in that are outside of education and not inside of education. And I think it's a good question to ask why. To what extent can accountability systems generate useful data for schools? I think the answer is they can if they are well designed. And I will get back to that in the second set of questions. I do think that designing the metrics means paying attention to what you want the metrics to do. And I think current accountability, performance-based accountability at the moment is only interested on outputs on test scores, really. It sets up a trajectory that will take a child from successful performance in the primary school to successful performance in the secondary school and then university. And by then, when they've got a degree, they can hack their way out of the poverty with which they started. This is just ridiculous. It is delaying all of the problems, but it keeps out of the system the metrics about poverty. It keeps out of the system the metrics about drugs in a local community and the effects they may be having. It keeps out of the metrics mental health. It keeps out of the metrics how schools respond to those challenges that they face, which is why you then end up with schools just excluding kids that they can't deal with, because the metrics gives them no sort of brownie points. That's a very silly English expression. It does not reward them. The metrics don't reward them for hanging on to those kids. So I think you could devise a system that would work differently. It would mean proper discussion, including across the research community, on what the relevant metrics are. And it would also mean hacking our way out of a very economic-dominated set of perspectives brought to bear on accountability, which is always trying to measure inputs against outputs with a tight kind of causal logic built in, which actually can't be sustained and can't survive scrutiny. Are there experiences of accountability policies that can build on instead of undermining professional autonomy? I think from the English case, what is interesting about that is that in England is one extreme, and it's mad, and it's on its own, in its own derangedness. We are part of the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom is always also Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales. None of them run high-stakes accountability systems. They have other problems. They have other problems which are very similar to the problems the Catalonian inspectors raised with us yesterday, that in some schools of high poverty, there is little effort to try and ameliorate things for kids. That the emphasis goes on care and more than it does on pedagogy. And people in Scotland are kind of concerned about that. They've tried soft accountability ways of engineering conversations in which people will, really consider what's going on here. And I think stakeholders find those kinds of conversations very difficult. And I can come back to some alternatives when we rerun the round.
So let me pick up on that last point, kind of where you highlighted the differences between the four UK nations. To me, that also speaks to the fact that maybe there is not one contemporary trend in accountability. There are just many trends that vary across countries. And I think that's something that we've heard in this conference as well. In the Netherlands, for example, which is the country where I do much of my work around accountability, but I've also worked with SIGI, which is the European Association for School Inspectors in Europe. Some of the discussions there are really about how do we organize accountability systems that take into account kind of network level outcomes where schools collaborate in professional networks to provide inclusive education, for example. That's a discussion currently going on in the Netherlands, thinking about what type of accountability approaches would fit kind of this network governance approach. So that's a really relevant discussion, but also how do inspections need to look at other types of outcomes, such as social emotional development of children, is something that many inspection agencies are currently really looking into. So there, I think if they were to listen in on our conversations about performance-based accountability, they have a completely different agenda, I think. They're really concerned and thinking about other topics at the moment. I just wanted to also briefly talk about intelligent accountability, as I've been doing quite a lot of work on that in the past couple of years as well. And my own thinking on that topic is particularly informed by Onara O'Neill's Reed lecture in 2002, where she really kind of put that topic on the agenda, not for education, but for accountability in public services more generally. Where she talks about how intelligent accountability is needed to stop kind of bureaucratic access to overcome hyper-regulation, and where she really brings into the discussion the issue of trust. So she talks about intelligent accountability as a system which preserves and enhances trust among key participants in the school context, between school and the community, but also trust, for example, between those who hold to account and who are held accountable, a school inspector and a school leader, for example. How is trust needed for that relationship to work and for accountability to actually lead to improvement of learning outcomes? And that in itself is quite a huge discussion in literature around organizational management, for example. Can you have a relationship where you combine trust and accountability? Is accountability not premised on the idea of distrust? So intelligent accountability would really be kind of looking at a complementary perspective where you have accountability in place that really builds a relationship of trust, is based on trust by informing partners about these are strengths and weaknesses, this is how you can improve, having an open and deliberative conversation about that. I think during the conference we have heard many examples of where that is not happening, where trust and accountability are not kind of in a complementary perspective, but where control mechanisms damage trust, where it's based on distrust. So intelligent accountability would really kind of try to enhance trust by building on relationships, conversations, both on the individual accountability relationship level as well as looking at how that is organized as a system in a country. And the kind of key dimension that is needed for that is capacity. You need to have the capacity to have those conversations. You need to have capacity as a teacher to perform well. You can't be held accountable for high quality outcomes if your kids don't have textbooks, for example, to work with, or if you're in a poor environment where kids come to school without breakfast and you can't teach them because they can't concentrate. So thinking about intelligent accountability is also where is capacity needed to make that work.
So I'm gonna answer this question from a perspective that links a little like academic work with activism. And I came from this organization that is called Alto Alcimse, as some people who in this room also are or were at some point of their life. And we have always this question related to the purpose of accountability. And it has for us to do a lot with justice and solving inequality. We started the campaign Alto Alcimse, and you know about the CIMSE because you have been listening about Chile for almost the full conference as this example of like how things can get really messed up. And we started this campaign in the context of the student mobilization that I hope you also know that since 2006 and even before, high school students and their university students are claiming and walking on the street asking for, among other things, free, public and quality education. And the question of quality is the one that caught all our attention. And we were a bunch of researchers that we were information in different universities. We have funding to study and we have time to think about this stuff. And we realized that the question of quality was key in the sense that it was kind of a Trojan horse. Because under the quality word, they can do a bunch of stuff. And one of the stuff that they were doing was linking quality with like test scores and linking quality with like the results in the CIMSE test. So at the end, what happened is we get like a system of hyper accountability under the banner of we are like following what the student want. And when we create Alto Alcimse was kind of to stop that narrative and to disrupt it and to also propose a different point of view, a different idea of what accountability can look like. Our first thing, as I was telling you, was to we developed three main strategies or three main goals as campaign. One was to change the common sense to delink the question of quality with the question of SIMSE. The second one was to really make alliances with social movement, especially with teachers and with students. And the third one is the one I'm gonna go a little more deeper, was to create a new imaginary of what evaluation can be, of what accountability can be, in order to use the space that was going to be left out by the SIMSE with a new idea that respond to this principle of justice that is behind this claim for quality that the students were asking when they were mobilizing. So our thesis, our first thesis was that the SIMSE can become this Trojan horse, but the second thesis that also was that the SIMSE can become this point of unity, in the sense that everybody is affected by these accountability policies as if they are being implemented in Chile. Parents, students, and teachers. All of them are having a bad time in schools because of the consequence linked to this test. So we can start conversations and we can build solidarity among these groups in order to contest the effects of the SIMSE and what is behind that, which is neoliberalism and market-oriented reforms. So starting from that, and after we always have been trying to achieve that, that has been like an ongoing challenge, we needed to present a different narrative regarding what accountability may look like. And we started to do this, and we have an open opportunity. One of the student leaders in 2017, 14, 16, around that time, was the first one who got a political position, like managing a municipality, as a mayor of a municipality. And among the people who was working with the organization with Alto SIMSE was a principal who became the director of education of this city that is called Valparaíso. And we have the opportunity to create something different, some sort of alternative that keep the accountability but transform the sense and the way in which we see it and in which we perform it. So we decide, after many conversations, to center our work into 4 principles that this new accountability that we were thinking should have. The first one is that, as has been told in this table, it needs to be responsible to the needs of the school and their communities and the territories in which they are located. It has to be contextualized. It cannot be one measure for all of them. Also, it needed to empower teachers, rely on their professional judgment, foster the appropriation of the teacher's work, and incentivize professionalism, which what we know has been one of the things that is not happening with like common accountability reforms. Also, and this was important, it has to have the capacity to inform public policy and policy makers at the local and at the national level. Because it needs to be able to, so they need to be able to support the schools. And well, I will delve a little more into this proposal in the next round of questions.
Thank you very much for your interventions in this first set of questions. Now we move to the second set of questions, focused on advocating accountability reforms. what is your experience in advocating accountability reforms in your countries or internationally? What are the main challenges or sources of opposition that you have faced? And have you identified a strong instrument constituency in the terms that we've been discussing this concept in the conference, with an interest in keeping performance-based accountability as it is? We will go now the other way around, so Javier, you can continue.
So what we did, we got a small budget to try a pilot experience that we can escalate later to the full city. So we invited some voluntary schools to join us, and we asked for some like previous commitment by the municipality. One of it, also George mentioned it, was time. We needed time for teachers, paid time for the teachers to implement this innovation that we were going to start. Then we looked for a partner. We were academic, but we were not expert in evaluation at that point. And we have one of the participants who worked at the University of Chile. She was really involved with the assessment for learning, and she offered to bring her knowledge, and we did some sort of alliance where they bring this new technology, the assessment for learning technology, but Alto Alcimse keep like a role of systematizing what's happening in the schools in order to sustain the principles that I told you before. Like, for example, the participation of the community, the teachers' empowerment, etc., etc. We didn't want for this to become like a normal teacher training, but we want that something that really relies in the knowledge of the community and on dialogue in order to build this system. Also, we want to understand what worked and what didn't work from this process. And the last task that we gave to us was to develop a system where we can like bring up and down the information that was produced in the schools. So at the school level, it was voluntary the participation, and we negotiate, as I told you, time for the teachers to do this, and we defined some goals with a network, the network of schools that were working in this pilot, and the goal has to be linked to the needs of the territories where they were like located, situated. How we did this, we made it in consultation with parents, but mostly at this point because of those resources with the teachers that knew the community and are the best informed about what are the needs also of their students, etc., etc. We create a council among the schools, and we define what are going to be our goals to develop. And we use the tools of assessment for learning to evaluate this as scenarios of learning scenarios. So, for example, a learning scenario was like I was explaining last night. The second degree was planning a birthday for all the kids who were born in March. And to develop a birthday, they need to develop a budget, they need to buy the stuff, and all the stuff became numeracy metrics kind of, or numeracy indicators, and the teachers collected evidence, and they came and talked with the other teachers in the school about this evidence and what does it mean in terms of learning of their kids. And then they meet with the school teachers from all the territorial network, and also they discuss like what does it mean in terms of learning and where were the needs of their kids, and what do the teachers need in order to be able to achieve these goals that they have proposed for their kids. And this is the information that we sent to the middle level. So it was really related, the accountability at this point, with the professional development of the teachers. And that was kind of like a key factor that we try to pursue on this, like really link the evaluation process with professional development at this point. The middle level also has a role, and the role was really to assure the teachers that nothing will happen if they don't put all the 7th grade that were expected by the curriculum. And really play this role of saying it's okay what you're doing, because we have been for so much time working in this like grade-based, SIMSE-based kind of education that the subjectivity of the teachers was altered. So finally, the short story and the sad part of this story is that we have also a chief of governance in the school system, and the pilot stayed as a pilot. Like, it was a good experience, stay as a pilot. The COVID came, the chief in governance of this place came, but the schools, at least during the COVID time, the schools that participate in this experience were some of the schools that took more easy the transition from in-person learning to outside of the school learning. Why? Because they were not under the pressure of like passing all the content. They were just under the understanding that the kids need to continue learning. I don't know how much time I have. One more minute. As I told you, the COVID interrupted this experiment and also achieved in the governance, and I can explain that if you have questions like how that happened. But now we have a new challenge. Like, we have a president now that also came from the student movement, and one of the goals of the new Ministry of Education is to end with the application of the SIMSE. And we need to develop or think now in a national type of assessment that keep this goal of accountability linked to justice in place, but without this test. And where we're thinking, what we're imagining, and this is just really preliminary, is that it has to be really related to how we achieve the right to education for these kids, and what are the conditions for that. And in this sense, our proposal for intelligent accountability goes beyond the learning, but also to the condition in which this learning happens. And specifically also thinking in this kind of a slogan that we share with a lot of union, that the teachers' working conditions are the student learning conditions. And if we want to think in accountability, we need to think in the conditions in which the kids are learning, like the number of students per classroom, the time that teachers have to prepare their classes, and all this other stuff that we know have a deep influence, but are never considered in the instrument that evaluate students.
So I often get asked the question, what is the best accountability system? What is the best inspection system? And what can we learn from it? Well, we heard yesterday, I think Patrick Lagal was saying it, we can't use the term best practice, and I completely agree with that, because there is just no best accountability system or type of reform that I would recommend to countries. It kind of depends on where you're coming from as a country and what is needed to improve schools. So how I've kind of tried to advocate for a reform is to really work with national governments or inspection agencies in trying to understand their kind of policy theory around why their accountability system would work in terms of improving schools. So I've used theory-driven evaluation and reconstructing policy theories to really understand their assumptions of why inspections, for example, would lead to change in schools, what mechanisms of change would underpin that, and then really have kind of a critical discussion with them around, well, this is what we know from research evidence on what works in what kind of context and what doesn't work or what has adverse outcomes. So to really try and kind of bridge the gap between research and practice on the policy level to try and ensure that reforms around accountability are also more evidence informed, or at least kind of have a strategic discussion around this is what we know from research evidence on how some of these systems lead to certain outcomes, and what will that look like in your specific context. And then also having that discussion about how is this going to work in different types of schools, because we talk about countries as if it's something homogeneous, but we know, particularly in the context of increasing inequality, that the conditions that schools are facing, the student populations that they are serving, are quite different across countries as well. So how accountability policies, frameworks will play out in schools will also vary tremendously within a country. So given that many of these frameworks, inspection frameworks, test-based accountability, use very standardized approaches that assume that all schools have the same capacity, are working in the same conditions, this is also something that we then start to think about. What are some of the expected outcomes that we might see differently across some of these contexts? So that all sounds like a very ideal situation, like you have conversations with the ministry and with the inspection agencies, and that will help them to actually kind of come to more evidence-informed approaches to accountability and inspection. And sometimes when you leave the table, then you have really have come to new insights and suggested changes to frameworks that everyone feels are going to be leading to more improvement in schools or be more supportive. But then obviously you have the routines in place, you have the political context and kind of values there in terms of what politicians want of school accountability. As Bob was saying, a real kind of a need to have metrics to be able to understand school quality. So it's these routines and mindsets that often come in between thinking about what is needed in terms of more effective accountability and why that's not happening. And that's not just on the national level, it also is on the level of schools, for example. Teacher professionalism is part of the title of this session. Many teachers are used to working in a very hierarchical environment where they just have to kind of meet external testing requirements or are used to working within a scripted curriculum. If you're trying to move to more professional types of accountability where they, for example, engage in peer review and look at each other's practices, provide feedback on the quality of lessons, and where you try to introduce that type of approach to really build system capacity for improvement, you also need to change that mindset. And when teachers think, well, we've been working in a kind of vertical, top-down approach for many years, and we're now expected to organize that ourselves, but wait a minute, maybe in a year or so the inspector is coming back in and then all of this will be out of the door. To what extent are they actually going to be engaging with that? So it's also thinking about where are they coming from, what are existing practices and expectations of people. And these routines and mindsets are often also what comes in the way of trying to make that change. So challenges on various levels, I would say, but still, that shouldn't keep us from trying, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm going to talk to you. Javier and Melanie have both been talking from practical first-hand experience of things that they've done. I'm talking to you about a proposal that a panel of experts sponsored by the British Educational Research Association came up with to try and dislodge the accountability system in England. This depends upon having some understanding of what the accountability system in England looks like. It has 14 test points between years 5 and 16. And what it does with the test points is it measures progress between. And it has just introduced most recently a reception baseline assessment to be done within 4 weeks of a child turning up in the school. So you will get a child with no input from the school, freshly tested. And what we will then do is we will measure where they've got to by the time they arrive at year 6, and we can tell what the school has done in between. Think about it a minute. Even just pupil mobility, this cannot work. Teachers change, it's ridiculous. Okay, the person on the expert panel who knows most about this is Harvey Goldstein. Unfortunately, he died at the beginning of COVID. Harvey is a long-term critic both of PISA and also of the assessment procedures in England. He fought very hard to get value added into the metrics. In other words, that you pay attention to the context before making a judgment about the school. The very first list that Ofsted produced of the most excellent schools in England, they were all schools with middle-class populations because they hadn't taken into account the context in which children achieve. So he made it his business to kind of try very hard as a very eminent social statistician to blow the system up. And we came to the conclusion collectively on the panel, along with myself. I got to convene it because I was bureau president at the time. Harvey was the kind of person who created the impetus. We also had Pam Sammons, who's very well known internationally around her work on early years and investing in early years. We had some people from the school sector and the inspectorate and various other people involved. What we came up with is, I still think, has real potential as a model to try and engineer change. And we decided that rather than go down the assessment for learning route, I am interested in Javier trying to make that space work. We thought, okay, let's keep an accountability metrics that can do system quality, but let's take it out of testing however many children there are in the school system 14 times to be able to tell whether the system is working well or not. I mean, this is the amount of resource that gets put into the testing is ludicrous. So Harvey's idea was to set up a national sample. Okay, set up a national sample, run them longitudinally, make them a representative sample, find out what progress looks like, genuinely what progress looks like, as opposed to an input and output score and a black box in the middle in which you claim that all is down to what the school did. If you set up a national sample and ran a combination of test instruments that might look more broadly than literacy and numeracy, could also look at creativity, could also look at sport, you know, whatever it is that people want, so that you're not ending up with metrics that themselves narrow the curriculum, and what you're interested in is kind of trajectories over time. We wanted to add to that, and this may seem a bit bizarre, the kind of questionnaires that PISA uses. In other words, you would ask the schools in the sample, you'd have teacher questionnaires, pupil questionnaires, parent questionnaires. You would then find out things about the local community that currently on our current system of metrics you don't pick up, and you could afford to do it because you'd be collecting richer data from fewer kids. What we also then imagined around this is, okay, that's our longitudinal national sample, that's the richer information we're collecting from fewer pupils. We imagined that we would create a bank of assessment instruments that schools could tug down. So if they are particularly nervous about their parents, because their parents really want to know how my kid is doing, you could run the test instrument at a time of your own choosing, and you could compare it with the national sample if you wanted to. We would like also regular reports on the national sample to aid system level monitoring by the government, but crucially we would then put into this the space for conversations between researchers working on the national sample and the parents and the schools and the teachers. What are the themes that are turning up? What are we learning from the investment in the national sample? What does it mean for you. You and your school could commission some research that would pick up a theme that was relevant to you. So we're reimagining what the community is. I mean, the instrument constituency, reimagine the instrument constituency so that it has a more democratic and open and dynamic relationship involved, and actually produces new kind of interactions between key stakeholders. Okay, that's the good news. The bad news is that we have tried very hard to sell this, we don't bother with the Tory party, what is the point? But we do try very hard with the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is incredibly nervous about doing anything that might take out the grading system associated with our current inspection, because they think it is the key indicator for quality and parental choice. And they don't want to mess with that because they think that will mess with their electorate. They don't understand and don't value that if we went this way, they'd get all the teachers in the land would vote for them. They don't pay any attention to that. We have had no uptake. What we have done, it's fed into, and Diego knows a lot about this, the More Than a Score Alliance, which campaigns against testing. They have tried very hard to get uptake amongst other MPs. They keep on trying to sell it to them. Sometimes those of us on the panel think they've compromised a bit too much and are selling it as a bit more kind of quality judgment that persists rather than this open way of exploring issues that matter in terms of system improvement. The most recent opportunity I've got is to talk to people in Wales about it, because the Welsh Government, without any performance indicators, has decided it wants to make pupil progress, the key thing that will hold teachers to account, and it has no measures. So I'm thinking, could we sell them a national sample right now that could do the progress measures for them and help teach? And then if we get it into one place, could we get it other places? So anyway, there you go. Yeah. It's an imaginary.
Yeah, but there's a lot of hope, and it's a wonderful imaginary, I think. And I mean, what I would say is the work that we did in this rural area with 8 schools, I think it would work perfectly if at the system level we had your model. Yeah. I mean, I can see, if I were the Director General, spare us, but this is the model that I would, the route I would go down. Just in terms of the story I told of our account, I just want to make this point that it took 5 years for trust to be built between the school and the community and the school, the teachers, principals and us, and with senior people in the department. It took time, and there was money that we had to release teachers to do work, go into the community, and so on. But why did that, it just struck our research team that at the moment it ended, we were just at the moment it would have been most propitious to start the project again, and I think it would have been many, many more productive things would have developed. So why didn't it? One new person in the system, which is interesting, I think. We have to remember, in the Australian context, a progressive Labor government was introduced, was voted in 2007, and it was that government that introduced national testing, aligned with Labor governments in every state and territory in Australia. Conservative governments couldn't do it because of teacher union opposition, and the way it was introduced was that there were 2 programs, and they were great national programs. One which was just an SES measure, which poured more money than it's ever gone into Australian schools, into the schools serving the poorest communities, redistributive. And then there was a literacy and numeracy program which poured money into the schools that were performing poorly on the tests. It struck me it was a very reduced definition of social justice, but it was the way the system could do it. And of course, Labor lost in 2013. All that redistributive funding is gone. As Amanda said this morning, in Australia now we redistribute school funding to the richest schools. It's a despicable disgrace, and hopefully the new government elected 3 weeks ago might do something about this. We hear a lot of talk of evidence-based policy. I reject the idea. I think it's always only ever evidence-informed policy, and all policies are an admixture of evidence, research, data, evidence, professional knowledges, and discourses, politics, ideology. And I think in this domain, there's so much academic research in Australia that shows the damage this mode of accountability does, but it has no effect whatsoever on the policy, which I think is really interesting to me, and is evidence, if you like, that it's not evidence-based policy, and the ideological, I think, functions more strongly in relation to it. And in that period, 2013 to 2022, with a Conservative federal government, 3 state Labor governments commissioned the best people in Australia to review the impact of NAPLAN and how it worked, and brought out a very substantial report. It had no effect. The minister in Queensland, a Labor minister, I was on a group that was commissioned to look at teacher, and there's been a subsequent report on community, but teacher and principal views. The teachers were a huge sample. Teachers overwhelmingly negative about the impact of performance-based accountability. The school principals were sort of half and half. Half thought it was a good thing, half not. Interesting, I think. So why has this model stayed in place? And I do think the instrument constituency argument does give an explanation. So when Labor won in 2007, introduced NAPLAN for the first time in 2010, the test, the form of performance-based assessment, they created an authority, Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, which is funded in shares from the states, territories and the federal government. It has this huge part of it which is about managing NAPLAN, experts, psychometricians. Each of the states have divisions within their departments that do this work. And then there's the Australian Council of Educational Research. There are all of these consultants out there working with schools as well that work here. So there is a strong instrument constituency. And one of the strongest in the Australian context is the media. Like, I've talked to editors of the national newspapers and they tell me they sell more newspapers on the day the national test results come out than on any other day of the year. And then you see the reports go on for days and days. And last year, in the best-selling books in Australia, the second biggest selling was a book produced by the Sydney Morning Herald about how to prepare your child to perform well on NAPLAN. So and then the politicians. There's the Conservative politicians, but there's also a swathe of Labor politicians as well. You know, for a whole host of reasons, and all of the good arguments, but recognising that you need other complementary things if the data is going to be used in a productive sort of way. So I'd make the point again that the sort of approach we were working with would work if you had a different systemic approach to accountability, and I think the model that Gemma and Harvey Goldstein and others for BERA developed would be really positive in that respect. And just to pick up on a couple of the points that have been made as well, I've always thought Bourdieu was interesting when he says the state holds the legitimate right to create the universal. That is, the policy applies to everyone in the same way. And I think when you look at schools, the point that you were making, that when you look at schools, there's a thisness about every school. And so there's a disjunction, in a sense, between that right to apply the universal and the thisness, which I think is really, really interesting. And the last point I'd make, and I think Melanie picked up on it, that the notion of professional autonomy, teaching as a profession and so on, and Amanda dealt with some of this morning, I think that's another area that we need to get into and perhaps re-theorise, not only in terms of what's actually happening with performance-based accountability and reconstitutions, perhaps, of teacher professionalism, but what, with different modes of accountability, the sorts of models we've been trying to suggest, how would we think of teacher professionalism in such an accountability system? Because I think just talking about professional autonomy, you know, how has professional autonomy worked historically in bureaucratic structures for teachers? So I just think that's another part of the equation which we really haven't had time to deal with, but I think is something that we need to think about. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your contribution to this debate. We have now a couple of minutes for questions and answers from the audience.
Hi, thank you for very enriching presentations. I'm from Argentina. And at the risk of sounding obvious and naive, if we are to think different narratives, maybe we could start by thinking of another term, because especially in Spanish, accountability translates into rendición de cuentas, which is connected to holding accountable. I mean, there's no way to disconnect the term to the meaning. And this to me is a concern, because the way we talk, the way terms we use in education, they tell us about the way we reason about education. So if you use the term, and especially in the Spanish-speaking countries, there's no way to think only on the how to move for improvement, and not in other more maybe important questions, and what do we need improvement for whom? So I have a problem with the term, but thank you for all the enriching and helpful insights.
I'm Emily Winship from Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. I'm just thinking about this as we're here at the conference talking about SAWA and the global side of this, that even as I'm listening to the discussion about how we could improve this in England, I'm thinking in England they would say no, because then we can't compare the results of what we've done in our system-wide survey of students. You know, in all of these things, when we're looking at it at that national level, I think we started off in the first keynote saying there's no such thing as national accountability, it's this global system. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about that.
Do you want to say something?
I think they're doing it.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay.
I'm writing them down.
Yeah.
I could say something back to them. Do you want to go for accountability in Spanish?
Oh, God. Yeah, great. And what about?
Maybe I can take the first question about the term accountability. It's a really good one. Do we need another term, or the meaning of the term? What does that actually indicate? In the Netherlands, the term accountability also translates quite differently. It is not really a term that you can translate literally. The terminology that we would have would talk about responsibility more. So there the term in Dutch, I would translate it as verantwoording, which is more about just taking responsibility, being transparent, etc. So there it also has quite a different understanding. So do we need a different term perhaps in the countries where it is problematic, and where it is particularly only talking about control? So we need to, I think, be clear about what we actually mean by when we talk about accountability. Are we talking about accountability relationships, specific types of instruments or measures that we use to hold people accountable? Or do we mean by accountability kind of as transparency, a system of evaluation? I mean, I often, when I talk to my students about accountability, I try to define it on those three levels, like the relationships between people, the types of instruments and measures that you use for accountability purposes, but then also a system that is transparent, that addresses corruption, that has a moral, ethical climate. So also these issues on the system level. So that's kind of what we need to be clear about, I guess. I don't know, anyone wants to add to this?
Just to say, I think that's a very nice reframing, actually. That in response, we are all of us responsible to others, for others, and others are also responsible to us. And it's getting that dialogic relationships built back into the school system that I think is really important, however it is we try and do it. To come back to the question about England and at the national level, we built in quite deliberately a means of politicians being able to scrutinise data over time. If you re-recruit your cohorts at a spaced interval, you can use it as a system quality measure, but you can do a normative curve. Have you gone up or down, and where the midpoint is? You could use it without damaging the interactions at classroom level, because you stopped it being a universal. I can't remember what the expression is in statistics, but it's not a census. All right. So you retain that capacity for people who worry, because I think that was part of our diagnosis, is that the way the system works at the moment, it is reducing the statistical legibility, intelligibility, anything. It's corrupting the measures that it uses, but actually that neuroticism about how well are we doing remains. So we wanted to build in ways of that still being there, but being less destructive. And that's why we thought if we had a test bank of instruments designed for the sample, schools could then use them. We were also, I mean, this is all imaginary, but we were imagining, that if you had used some test instruments and you were then being intelligent about what does this mean for my school, where do I need to invest, maybe schools could make an annual plan that they commit to. It's the annual plan. We're going to invest here because that you give to parents, so that you show your investment responsibilities and how your investment responsibilities will hopefully address things that matter here. You relocalize where the problems are, but you're able to do it with a large-scale architecture that can do the kind of system level. So our design was to try and make those multi-dimensionalities work and give maximum freedom to people at the different levels, but keeping things transparent.
And I will take your point about global pressures for accountability, particularly, I suppose, around PISA. It's a sample, of course, but the thing that frustrates me most about PISA, if you look at the best analyses, 2000 through to the present, what do you see across the 36, now 37 member countries, is a strengthening of the correlation between student SES background and performance. And I never see that reported in the media, amongst policymakers. In Australia, it's overwhelming, that data. What we have now is a discourse that dominates in the media in Australia, because Australia's comparative performance has gone down, that Australian schools are in crisis. But what do the data show us? They show us that there's growing inequality. The performance-based system is concentrating the most disadvantaged kids in particular schools, disadvantaging them in a structural way more, and the PISA evidence is overwhelming. So it seems to me, if you're going to have evidence-informed policy and read the data, you would do X, Y, Z in response, but that bit seems to get totally blanked out.
But that is also part of the problem. Bob, because we as a collective community complain about PISA and we don't use it back to re-bring those problems and make them transparent.
Yeah.
The most
Yeah.
useful piece of analysis of PISA I've ever done was with somebody called John Jerem, and we looked at the relationship. PISA asks, how much do you read of the following? All right, and it gives you a taxonomy, and we broke it down and we looked at the volume of reading that children claim to be doing, children at 15. There is a very high correlation between reading mostly fiction with higher attainment in PISA. It doesn't hold everywhere, and that's not in the published paper, but never mind. It's also regardless of gender and SES. All right, so high volume fiction reading is a boon. Now, that's also partly what a performance-based culture in a school level can actually strip out. We need to be putting it back in. But I think if we turn our backs on what the data is, we just need to bring out of it the things that need shouting about. And you should be shouting about.
I shout about it. And I go on the radio, they say, "Oh, you again. We know what you're going to say." I say, "Oh, thanks."
There's a question there.
3.
Hi, my name is Sheena Bell from the University of Toronto. I really enjoyed this panel discussion, and it seems to me that sort of the hyper testing is basically a very strong reflection of like seeing like a state, and the system has very much moved to this kind of thing, and this reimagining of accountabilities is almost like seeing like a school, or seeing from the ground, and what's that reality like, and what perspectives and information and context really matters at that. But I could see your point, Bob, where you spend 5 years developing this very rich, multi-stakeholder, trust-based thing, and then when it comes to scale up or to talking to the government, they don't quite see. They want a metric. So I was just wondering, how do we make these rich accountability forums that we really need legible to government and policymakers? And I think Gemma has talked to some of these ideas of not throwing out all accountability, but trying to at least make it less pernicious. But I was wondering more on reflections of that, of how we sell that. For example, in the 5 years that you did you do any sort of data collection on, say, teacher motivation over those 5 years, or did school performance increase in those 8 schools, or anything like that that could maybe sell it a little bit to the
We did. The idea was we would have a final forum like this with all the teachers, all the principals, all the students, all the community members, and the senior executive of the department, the local politicians, to speak back and to now. The new Director General was supposed to have, I don't know if I should say this, was supposed to come the day before, rang me and said he couldn't come, the Deputy would come, and the day of our forum, the Deputy couldn't come, and I kept thinking, well, we now know how significant they think our research project is. But having said that, the person that came was good, and all that came from all the participants speaking to the department was, this is the sort of things that we want to do. And it's not only about, like one principal, and some people have heard me say this, her school in the time, the 5 years, was totally flooded, closed down for 2 weeks at one and 3 weeks in another. And she advertised over 2 weekends for people to come and help clean up. And over 1,000 people turned up on a Saturday and a Sunday and worked all day at her school. And she actually rang me up and said, Bob, this is one form of accountability I want to be held to account for. This community thinks this school's a significant institution, and that same principal said to me she had the data to show that her school was now becoming the school of preference for the Indigenous community because she changed the culture of the school. She had welcome to country. They had embedded Indigenous perspectives across the curriculum, language recognitions, and she said clearly and the attendance of the kids. So honestly, I'm not, being Pollyanna, but there were just positive responses from all of the groups. And one of the local politicians told us that she was stopped in the street over and over by the parents of the kids, by teachers, and that she contacted me, emailed, saying, we want this to go on now. Well, so I want to be hopeful, because I think, we've just had a change of government, so I feel like a different person because we had the worst government in our history. And even in 3 weeks, what's happened, I keep telling Gemma, I think it is quite amazing. So I hold out some hope that, but I don't know. So whenever I raise that class stuff, they say, oh, we know you for 40 years, you've been telling us this stuff. Do you know what I mean? But the situation's got worse. So, in terms of SES, sorry, I'll shut up.
I want to address a little also this question, because one of the things that we need to think about or process, or this type of process, is that they take time, like long time. And within this time, we need to be building and creating alternatives and imaginaries. And at some point, these imaginaries make sense for one politician, and one window of opportunity is open, which now, for example, happens in Chile. So now in Chile, we have an opportunity to stop the CIMSE finally. But this has been a process that has been building for like many years, and we don't know where this is going to land either, because we have opposition even like within the left or the political party of the president. Yeah. But with this experience of Valparaiso, we at least can say we can do it in a different way, and it happened, and it created good outcomes for the people, and students were happier and teachers were happier, and that brings an argument to the conversation that also has some weight. And then, the discussion is gonna be political. And we also need to sort of infiltrate the political spaces where these decisions are being taken. So at some point, we can, from our academic stance, also recommend like which director of education is better suitable for which accountability system. And we don't end as George was telling us.
I think that we had 2 more questions, but we are running out of time, so we should probably continue the discussion in the coffee break. The coffee break will be a very short coffee break, well, not short coffee break, but only coffee, not food, because we have later the closing ceremony. So a big applause to this session.